But I thought of this seminar as a kind of experimental seminar. So I am talking about new work, and it is quite unconnected, I'm afraid, to a lot of the issues I think that were discussed throughout the days. Economic development, mostly, I gather. But for me, it is a wonderful opportunity to people like you who are really in a different field to get your responses. So, you know, it is experimental, it is new work. Now, some of you may know, some of you may not. I really operate in at least two worlds. And one is the world of geopolitics, where my latest book was on that, in fact. For the last 10 years, I've been working very hard. And in the world of geopolitics, especially global geopolitics, the city never appears. So, and I'm not totally an urbanist, but I find myself always arriving at the city, which is a very interesting way of doing urbanism. So in this world of geopolitics, of global geopolitics, whenever I look at one of the major issues, the environmental challenge, asymmetric war, etc., I arrive at the city. And I think that is sort of, that has been my role a bit as a person who has worked on cities in this world of geopolitics. I just came from Rio, where I got this little pneumonia that I have, where it was a meeting, this was a meeting of the BRICS, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So that is national governments, and they invited me to talk, you know, about how the city fits into that. That just gives you an idea. So there is a growing opening towards the question of the city in that world of global geopolitics. But it is not a very comfortable match. What I want to talk now briefly is about the question of asymmetric war and cities, the new types of wars. Not just, for me, that when I use the term new wars, it is not just traditional armed conflict. I'm also interested in such questions as, this is part of this research project, such questions as the gangs, the kinds of gang warfare we're seeing in Ciudad Juarez, in Rio, etc., which still, if it happens in the city or in an urban setting, it usually gets handled in terms of criminality, the two master categories, if you want, are criminality and inadequate policing. I'm arguing that, in a way, gangs are a variable. So at one end, it might be criminality and inadequate policing, but at the other end, it is a form of armed conflict. And the categories that relate to the city in a narrow sense, criminality and policing, are not the adequate categories. I also, in the research that I'm doing on the environmental challenges and how they become concrete, specific, empirical, etc., in cities, I also find that that conflicts that are likely to explode may well become part of this category that I'm using of the new wars. By saying new wars, I'm also engaging in a critique with the master category of war. I think that a lot of armed conflict today does not comfortably fit into the historically produced category of war, which is to some extent also a Western category. There are, you know, there are laws for war, etc., etc. So there is something else that is happening. Now, there are three issues in terms of cities that I want to look at. One is the notion that we have a kind of emergent urban global geopolitics, or we can call it urban geopolitics. We have a kind of multipolar world that has been explained mostly in terms of the rise of China and the decline of the United States, which, if you look very carefully, you pick up also in the growth, the proliferation of a whole bunch of cities, global cities, major and minor, which also are building in stone a multipolar world. So in one of the big studies that I was part of, which we covered 75 cities, 60 variables, a team of 8 experts, including the senior economists of the Institute of Economics in China, those kinds of people, so truly international, it became clear that American cities, except for New York, Chicago, etc., are experiencing a relative decline in their global position. And this is not opinions, by the way. The 60 variables were measures, not opinions. small European cities rise, and of course Asian cities rise, and some Latin American cities rise. So what you pick up is a kind of multipolar world, which is of course part of the geopolitics, that is also built in stone, that is done through this, that happens through cities. The second issue that I find very interesting is the notion of how today, this is geopolitics again, weak regimes manage to confront and halt, to some extent, very powerful militaries or very powerful, great military powers. They don't destroy those military powers, but they can hold them. And one of the things that I want to do here very quickly is sort of examine to what extent the city is a weak regime. Now, of course, it's a way of using language that is a bit theoretical, you understand? This is not, the city is a regime, no. But it's the equivalent, systemically speaking, of a weak regime. And in that sense, it can halt a certain kind of military power. Now, I have done this work of how weak regimes can confront very powerful and halt, not stop, not destroy, but sort of weaken, if you want, ironically weaken great power. So I've done that with human rights, etc. But just as an example, just to make it a bit concrete perhaps, if you think of killing 800,000 people, or of destroying a city with 800,000 people, that would be unacceptable today. We let millions of people die from curable diseases every day. So what is it about the city? It's this mix of built environments, people, etc. It's not just number of people. There is something else about the city that makes that simply unacceptable. So in that sense, again, very figuratively speaking, the city also as a weak regime, systemically speaking. Then, well, let me just move into this. Now, asymmetric war is a concept I'm sure that all of you are familiar with, right? So I don't need to really elaborate, but basically it is the encounter between a conventional military power and an unconventional combatant. The classic example of the contemporary moment, the United States Army bombs Iraq for 6 weeks and succeeds fully. And then another war begins. And so this notion of asymmetric war, which has been much talked about by political scientists, by political theorists, by everybody, but from the perspective of the city, what also happens is that asymmetric war urbanizes war. And hence the city becomes a technology for war, a technology against war, etc., etc. And I'm interested in understanding, well, what difference does that make? Now, what do I have here? I can't even remember this. So now, given that context, we could ask the question, does the urbanizing of war make legible the limits of military superiority and the limits of war? Because I'm always interested in sort of a heuristic side in whatever research I'm doing. I'm not just interested in mapping and measuring, and I just want to understand, is a larger story being told by looking very carefully at a particular, empirical condition. So it's not just empirical condition per se. So in this sense, really, the larger theme is again this notion of weak regimes can actually engage big powers. Because I think without weak regimes and only brutal power or superior power, the world would be a very different place. Actually, it's a pretty bad place, but it would be, I think, much worse. Now, second point then, sort of the physics of civil society. And again, it's not just number of deaths. It's interesting, a city has hospitals, schools, houses, etc., etc. There is something about destroying a city and killing its people that carries a much deeper meaning, I think, than just death, due to disease, due to And then this is another way of another kind of language that I like to use, which is under what conditions does powerlessness become complex? So for me, powerlessness is a variable. At one end, it is elementary. At the other end, it is still powerlessness. It is not empowerment. That's the big thing, I think, for most people. So if you're powerless and something happens that is good, it has got to be empowerment. Empowerment, I think, is a very, very difficult thing to achieve, frankly. But elementary powerlessness is different from complex powerlessness. Complex powerlessness is, for me, a form of powerlessness that is pregnant with possibility, with history, with politics. And I really make a distinction between the fact of complex powerlessness and the people. The people themselves do not necessarily become powerful. They really don't. I have multiple examples that I could give you, but I think we want to move on, but in the discussion perhaps. Now, two major themes. I come back a bit to what I said earlier, the multiple meanings of the new urban wars. I just want to emphasize that for me there is a whole series of issues. And so this project links also with environmental, with et cetera, et cetera. And then the limits of power and war, because we are pretty impressed with power and with big bombs. And case after case shows the limits of even the biggest bombs and the most powerful armies. So I want to work with it. Now, did this move? No. So when cities confront conflict, and here I just want to, this is a stylized representation, if you want, of a city, in the sense that I argue that what really marks the city is commerce and the civic. The logic of the urban is not to militarize conflict. It goes towards triaging conflict and making the civic and making commerce. Now, this is very stylized. And I know there are cities that were fortresses, and I know that cities, et cetera, et cetera. But in contrast, confronted with conflict, national states have a logic embedded in their systematicity, if you want, that says, let's militarize conflict. So that is a bit the juxtaposition. Now, we can debate this to death, clearly, because many people will argue, but I do think that I need this stylized, differentiation of, we know that there are all kinds of countries, like the European countries, they really don't want to go to war. But still, I think that there is this really smart, sharp juxtaposition of the foundational logic, if you want, of a national state versus the foundational logic of a city or cityness. And so the question in the study, sort of to give it a bit of a shape, a hypothesis, if you want to explore, to study, is, are cities today losing this capacity to triage conflict and to make the civic and to make something good confronted with conflict? Now, here we have, and again, I think a lot of the economic stuff for me has that strength to it as well. The capacity to really destroy the civic, to destroy commerce. I think the financializing of our economies, I've done a vast amount of work on the financial stuff that is happening. The last 10 years, the last 20 years have been an extreme, I think, abuse almost in many ways of the finance. Finance is good under certain conditions. Finance makes capital. Finance compared to traditional banking is about, traditional banking is you sell money you have. Finance is about selling money you don't have. And hence it's very innovative. But what has happened in the last 10 years, it's really an abuse of that logic. They have just, at some point, the finance needs to be materialized. That capital that finance makes needs to be materialized and transformed into green housing, green transport, whatever, something. But you can't let it go on feeding on itself. So I want to emphasize that I do think that what we call some of our most advanced sectors are also contributing to this brutalizing, if you want, of the of urban economies. Here is a question of environmental change, the racisms, I think the city is at enormous risk. We're already seeing it, even in the most civilized countries of the world, like Europe. We have all kinds of virulent racisms, and it's horrible. So, you know, and for me, I should say, just as a footnote, for me the Civic is not just simply a question of a nice-looking city. The Civic, historically, if we think of it as a capability that is a collective production as opposed to a visual order, the Civic comes out of conflict. It comes out of difference. It represents precisely a capability because it manages to triage conflict into a third condition that we can think of as a positive. It is never perfect. It is not completely inclusionary, but it transforms that. So, for instance, I would argue that a well-run public transport system, a well-run public health system is the Civic. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, you know what I mean, but it is many other things. But it is a component of the Civic. It has meant that nobody's going to check, did you just murder your wife, or you, well, nothing. You played by the rules of the game and you're in. It meant opening it up to all kinds of groups that could have killed each other. So in that sense, the Civic really is an achievement. It's a collective achievement, and cities are, of course, a strategic space for the development of that capability. Is there a mic here or not? Can you all hear me? Because I have barely voice left. You know, I have pneumonia. I should just clarify that I picked up in Rio. But can people hear me in the back or not? Okay, good, because I cannot hear my voice very well. Now, for instance here, you know, can the new types of gang wars in Rio de Janeiro, Tijuana, be reduced simply, back to the original theme, to ineffective policing and crime? And it seems to me that no, that there's something much deeper going on. Now, in this framing, the pursuit of national security becomes the making of urban insecurity. And that is one of the reasons that I'm getting more and more to participate in sort of traditional geopolitical settings. You know, the question of the city never appears, but now suddenly you take the environment, you take war, you take all kinds of conditions, and including the gangs, of course. Now, this is another very interesting feature of the city, and here we begin to think of the city of urban space as a weak regime that can contest, in some ways, big power. So urban space, when you have a military right there, no matter if they're handing out lollipops, doesn't matter. They are an aggressive presence. And it's the space of the city, because those same types in a little village just would be probably different than in the setting of a city with the shops and the schools and I don't know what. Right. Now, here I want to enter a bit in the contemporary period, all right? And so that asymmetric war has made cities, all kinds of cities, one site, not the only one, in the map for war making. Oh, thank you. She's providing me lemons. I have everything. Here I can open a shop. A little. Now, several cities worldwide are becoming a key theater for asymmetric war, regardless of what side of the divide they're on, allies or enemies. Now, I want to emphasize, I've been doing this research, and we have actual research sites in Palestine. I just was in Palestine, in Rio, but that's a bit different, and in Baghdad. But, you know, when you begin to look at this question of asymmetric war, it's enormously variable. You know, it can be an elementary extension, I'm just reading off the slide, extension of the space for war. The one-shot bombings in London, Madrid, Bali, Casablanca, I mean, the list keeps getting longer. But the sort of one-shot events, except when you're dealing with Lahore, that's already a bit different, and other cities after the bombing of Iraq was launched. This was a very particular phase. There's a lot of historicity in the sense that they mark a particular historical moment in a trajectory that is not very long, certainly like 20 years, 10 years. None of these cities, this is very important, was part of the theater of war, as is used to be defined. But asymmetric war can also be a full extension of the space of war. Iraqi cities, Afghani cities, and to some extent Pakistani cities. Now, I want to focus just briefly on these kinds of things. In other words, cities that are sites in a map of war, but not part of the theater of war, this conventional language. So, and the other thing is this, the particularity, the thickness of the environment, the thickness of the conditions, and yet they're on that map. So sort of a negotiation between particularity and something a bit more general, more. So you can explain, because I do that, I've been writing about this. I can explain each one of these in terms of the specifics of that situation. You can do that. And yet something else is happening. So as material practices, these are localized actions by local armed groups acting independently from each other. It's not like there is some sort of... Yet they're also part, and this is the issue here, of a new kind of multi-sided war, a distributed and variable set of actions that gain larger meaning from a specific conflict. And this is, of course, the worrisome part of it, right? For all of us, so to speak. Larger meaning from a specific conflict with global projection, such as the war on Iraq. Now, there is a transversal set of issues here that we could bring in, which is this notion of a specific conflict with global projection. It's a whole category unto itself. And the question is, do we have more of that now? So that a conflict, which in the past would lack global projection, today becomes a conflict with global projection. And then you can have these other kinds of effects coming. Now, the other question we might ask is if the current urbanizing of war is different from past cases, because this is not a new story in some sort of generic sense. In all the wars, World War I, World War II, large armies needed large open fields or oceans to meet and fight and to carry out invasions. These were the front line. The bigger the army, the bigger the open space. World War I is probably iconic. Now, in World War II, we see certainly a use of the city as, as a military technology, one might say almost. Not as a site for making war, but as a technology for instilling fear. The full destruction of cities as a way of terrorizing a whole nation. Dresden and Hiroshima, probably the iconic cases. Now, here, what I'm really trying to get at is, could Dresden and Hiroshima happen today? And my answer is no, they could not. And that is where then it begins to become interesting. What is it about the space of the city, etc., that today, that doesn't allow that? Now, and the other way then of looking at this is the limits of military superiority and the fact that the city can contest some of that power. So even in conditions of absolute military superiority, can the countries with the most powerful conventional armies today afford to repeat Dresden? And my answer is no. The role of the civic, of law, of the growing global web of interdependencies to contest, often structurally, not organizationally. This is not sort of an organized capacity to contest absolute military superiority. It shows that under certain conditions, powerlessness can become complex. And the other thing that I want to point out is this is a capacity to restrain military power, but the capacity itself is not military. And that is another kind of asymmetry that I find extremely interesting, and I've used this notion also in all kinds of other things. But it seems to me very important, and I think the difference between the past and today, say World War II and today, is a kind of, it's some sort of global regime. It's an assemblage of regimes. That it's a mix of really of very weak instruments that have to do with law, with civil, with global whatever, subjectivities and I don't know, all kind of, it's an assemblage, it's not a system. But it is there, it's difficult to name. it's difficult to measure. And in a way, you have to take a bit of a pragmatic approach, philosophically speaking, to even know that it exists. In other words, the outcomes. That something, the outcome of a given situation is not quite what it ought to be. And one way of explaining the variance in that outcome is precisely the existence of something that remains a bit unnamed. You know, an unnamed X is one way of putting it. Now, there are a whole variety of restraints that are wired into urban space. You know, and here we could go on and on about all kinds of things, but I don't know what to say. Well, I'm just actually, this repeats a bit of what I have. I think I'm just moving to the next slide. I see that the time is moving. Now, one image that we can use at this point is to look at the city as a technology against war. In asymmetric war, the asymmetric combatant uses the city as a technology for war. And so the other side of that coin is, can the city also be a technology against war? And here we come back to the sort of the city as a systemically speaking weak regime that can contest superior power. And here, back to the question of the dead, right? Destroying a city, maybe 800,000, maybe 1 million people, whatever, just simply less acceptable than having millions of people die of diseases that we can cure with great facility. Mm-hmm. I mean, with not great facility, but with not vast resources. And so I don't have answers to this, but I think that these outcomes, if you want, tell us something, a presence of, again, this unnamed X, right? That, and in a lot of the the meetings that I've been at, you know, on asymmetric war and things like that, all the humanitarian system and all of that, these are puzzles. And so if I bring in the unnamed, the unnamed X, you know, the city very often, it is not the only one, but it begins to, but a lot of these people do not necessarily think in these terms, because this is, of course, a bit of a theoretical account, too. And in that sense, I find this extremely interesting. So one way of putting it is the city as a very complex but passive technology against war. I think the physical and human features of the city are an obstacle. It's not just the human, it's the physical and the human. So it's something about the built environment that attains a capacity, you know. And here I think that Norquist's presentation, when he talked about the difference that the built environment can make, I mean, I'm not saying that's the same thing, but I could not help but thinking about this. So I think I want to complete with this one. So also here we have then an asymmetry wired into the spatial markers of each side. I think I missed something there or not? Asymmetric war then makes visible not only the limits of power, but also the limits of war, which is another way. This is an as yet young proposition, but as it wires war into urban space, asymmetric war makes the city itself a technology of war that obstructs the power of conventional armies. I'm just summing up. And then the physics of civil society, et cetera, et cetera. I think I'm just going to leave it at that, right? Good time to end. All those Richard Green, I must say, I just sent him this stuff yesterday.
I wasn't going to use it as an excuse.
And then I realized who you were and that your work does not connect at all to this. So it was not my idea to put you in as my discussant, I should say.
I was going to blame Gary for this, so.
All right. Good.
So that's a good segue to what my opening was going to be, which is, this is an intimidating position to be in. I'm the last formal speaker on the program now. You know, I was hoping that Dalton Conway was going to follow me, in which case you'd forget everything I had to say and it wouldn't matter so much. But I've also followed a great deal of eloquence today. It was wonderful to spend the day where people seem to care about language when they get up and speak. But the other reason this is intimidating is I usually try to talk about things where I know what I'm talking about. Some of you may know that I have a blog, and the thing about blogs is there's a lot of freedom in what you say, but I really try to limit myself. The things I talk about on the blog are, okay, I brag about my kids sometimes on the blog. I write about music sometimes on the blog, but once in my life I did make money playing music, which means that I'm probably better than average at it and can say something reasonable about it. And I write about urban stuff, and I write about public finance, and I write about housing, which are things that, I've gotten referees to allow papers to be published on. So, those are the things I write about in the blog. I try not to write about, for example, health policy or global warming, even though I care about both of those things, and I think about both of those things, but I don't consider myself an expert on those things. So here I am discussing something about geopolitics. And I did read Thucydides when I was a freshman in college.
Well, that wouldn't help you too.
So no, but at least that's something. And so, I've been trying to think about what I'm going to say. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about war in cities by suggesting just some definitions and asking whether they might be reasonable ways to think about these things definitionally, including a definition of what war is. And then I'm going to just pick on some things that Saskia said about cities and about their development, which I do know something about that probably don't have a lot to do with war, but they're actually something I can talk about. Okay, so, but let me start about, because one of the interesting things about this is the question of the relationship between wars and cities and whether there's a new relationship between the two. And I do read a fair amount of history just because it's fun. And it occurs to me you could define the way cities are treated by war into at least 4 categories. I'm sure I'm missing a number, but you can think of cities as being things that could be sacked. Right, and this is where the Peloponnesian War sort of came in, is, okay, Sparta sacks Athens and basically destroys an empire by doing that. So Athens being a fairly small part of the population, but nevertheless the central place that determined civic society for a large region, its conquest by Sparta had a very profound impact on a broader region. Okay, so this says something about the importance of cities within a broader context. Occupying is the second category I thought of, is, okay, armies try to come in and occupy cities, and that's a really hard thing to do, because if the people in those cities don't like you very much as an army, I mean, they'd be taking pot shots at you fairly regularly. And it's actually interesting during World War II, the way different cities behaved with respect to how they were occupied by the Nazis probably said something about the character of those cities. It's interesting, if you go to Warsaw now, they are still very proud to tell you that they never were collaborators with the Nazis. I mean, 20-year-old, first thing you get off the airplane in Poland, people will tell you that. We didn't collaborate with the, unlike those guys in France or up in Norway, we didn't collaborate with the Nazis, okay? And that's what they said. I mean, formally, they didn't sign, there wasn't a formal Quizlet, right? There wasn't a formal Patan in Poland. And, they like to think it says something about them as a country, but clearly, occupying cities is a very difficult thing. You either got to conquer them, or
you destroy them.
Or that was my third point, is destroying. The third thing you can do is destroy cities. And, again, I was trying to think about, when does this work, or does it work? I thought it was thinking about in terms of norms. The interesting thing, the idea of what's acceptable and unacceptable even seemed to matter sometimes to Hitler, right? Because he could have destroyed Paris and he didn't. He blew up the railroad cart, but he didn't, okay?
It was not just a number of people.
But, no, it had nothing to do, he had no problem killing lots of people. But there was something about Paris, and by the way, Warsaw he didn't feel quite so sentimental about, as we saw a picture from John's presentation. If I remember correctly, 95% of Warsaw's productive capacity was wiped out by the Germans.
But Hitler had ordered Paris destroyed, right? Is Paris burning, that whole
But then when it was, I mean, he was convinced not to follow through on it. Right?
Well, just to stick minors into
his general defied orders.
But he could have then.
They bombed Rotterdam for 2 days after the Dutch surrendered, and then they took that picture and circulated it in Paris so that they could see what might happen.
But
let's not forget the Allied forces bombed.
Well, and I was just going to get to, but the point is, maybe the reason we don't destroy cities very much is, there's a famous, and I'm afraid it's been many, many years since I read it, but John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the ways he made his reputation was a study for the Defense Department on the impact of civilian bombing on war outcomes. And what he found is it probably had no impact. If anything, it might have had a negative impact because it galvanized the population against you. So maybe that's why we don't destroy cities. And then the fourth category is sort of terrorizing cities, and that seems to be the environment we're in right now. But I mean, in the context of terrorism, you think about 9/11, and I think about Timothy McVeigh. By the way, I have to tell a short. Let me depart from this for a minute on Timothy McVeigh. I was in London when Timothy McVeigh was executed, and I remember there were all these people in London holding up anti-death penalty signs and protesting the execution of Tim McVeigh. And I was thinking, if you really want to protest the death penalty, Tim McVeigh is probably not the best poster child to do it with. But when when it comes to terrorizing, and by terrorizing I don't mean carpet bombing, I don't mean destroying. By terrorizing I mean what we think of as terrorism. Is that really war? Do we want to treat that as war? And what has annoyed me for some time now is politicians saying, well, we have to go back to, we can't be pre-9/11 anymore. We can't treat this as police work. We have to treat it as armed conflict. When in fact, if you look at a lot of the failures that have brought about terrorism, I would call it a failure of police work. Is sort of the detective work that needs to be done, the very low-level intelligence that needs to be done in order to protect from this kind of thing, seems to be much more like police work than it does like defense work. And so the definition of terror, I think, as soon as you call it a war, you change the methods that you use in order to confront it, and that's actually been a problem for us. It's the lack of understanding that some of these things might be police things to do that's been a problem. The other thing with respect to terrorism, thinking about differences in civilian response, I think is interesting. And I don't know anything in particular about this. This just seems like an area worthy of future study as you're going through this route. It is striking to me. I go to New York fairly often. I go to Mumbai from time to time. I go to London from time to time. These three places have all had very different responses to the terrorist attacks that that they've suffered. And I think in a sense New York is the most interesting example because my sense is in New York they've gotten over it in a way that a lot of the rest of the United States hasn't. And one of the absurd things we do in terms of policy, oops, that was way too normalistic a statement to make, but something that strikes me as policy worth revisiting is the way we spend money on protecting ourselves against terrorism. Is the Department of Homeland Security has to send as much money to Omaha as it does to New York. And it has to send as much money per capita to Waco as it does to Washington, D.C. Well, I have a strong suspicion that, partly for the Athenian reason, terrorist attack on Omaha are less likely unless it is a Timothy McVeigh kind of thing, and that, again, our whole apparatus isn't set up to deal with that. London, again, is a city that seems to work extremely well, particularly in light of the fact that they've been suffering terrorist attacks for many years, and it's not just in the aftermath of the Iraqi war. Of course, no matter what you think of the Irish conflict, civilians were targeted for many years in London, and yet it seemed to be a city that functioned. And the final point in definition, the point about gang wars I thought was kind of interesting. The only thing is I do wonder whether the ability to control gangs is more a function of the rules of civic society than it is about any kind of issue with war. And I think about Paul Romer's work on the importance of institutions and civic society. You can observe cities that are on opposite sides of boundaries, and one in which sort of gangsterism is much more likely to take place than it is on the other, and that has to do with the rules and respect for rules. We don't have to just look at the US and Mexico. Think about, if you look at Poland on the one hand and former Soviet Union countries bordering it on the other, well, Poland hasn't been immune to mafia activity. If you look at it, there's much less of it there than it is immediately to the east, and that probably says something about attitudes toward rules and institutions and so on. Okay, final points. These are the nitpicks. I don't know where I am. Do I have a few more minutes? So there were a few comments that I can't let go. The first is cities warehousing poverty, and the idea that you're having greater amounts of income inequality as a result of this. I'm not sure that I buy that that's correct. One of the things that's striking to me when you talk to people in slums in South Asian cities, where conditions by our standards are appalling, if you ask people if they want to go back home where they come from, they don't.
Sure.
And in Bangladesh, there's actually a policy to give people money to leave Dhaka because the government is very concerned, in part because if you talk to government officials, they think cities are immoral somehow, and that there's something more virtuous about the rural life. So there's a policy where people will get like $300 in order to move from Dhaka back home. And $300 is a lot of money in Bangladesh. And nobody takes the money. Okay, so people are making this choice to live in these environments. And you go to a place like Dharavi in Mumbai, and it's terrible in a lot of dimensions. I don't want to underplay that, but it's a place of commerce. It's a place of social interaction. It's, I wouldn't be surprised if it's better than the place that a lot of the people who went there came from. So I think your terminology was a little loaded against cities there in an inappropriate way. Second, the comment about escalating racism. I'd like to see more evidence that this is true, if it is in fact true. When I look at the US, and again, I don't know about other surveys on this, but if you look at Pew attitudes toward race, Pew surveys on attitudes toward race, are we there yet? Not even close. I'm not going to pretend that. But are we getting better? Yeah, we are. And what's particularly striking is generational changes. In fact, when people of my generation and older die, I think a lot of the racial problems in this country are going to be solved. And to me, the key question is you ask middle-aged people, you ask old people how they feel about interracial marriage, about 60% are okay with it. You ask people my age about interracial marriage, about 80% are okay with it. You ask kids my age, kids who are my kids' age about interracial marriage, late teens, early 20s, they're all fine with it. Okay, and I think that's a really key. That's where the rubber really meets the road. Okay, in terms of people's social attitudes. So I think if you're going to say, So if you're going to make an assertion about escalating racism, I think it's important to demonstrate that that's really true. Maybe in London it is true, although I actually am skeptical about that.
I'm not on that general level. I'm sorry, I'll just pass over that.
Okay.
Keep on talking. Yeah.
And then the final point about international norms and constraints preventing the likelihood of a Dresden ever happening again, or a Hiroshima. I hope you're right. I'm not that confident. And the reason is, if Robert Mugabe had the ability, Robert Mugabe's been willing to starve his own people, right? Do I think Ahmadinejad might drop a bomb on a city if he had access to one? I wish I could be 100% confident the answer to that was no. But I'm not 100% confident that the answer to that is no. So, is it the case that do I think, say, the United States, Japan, China, Western powers are unlikely to do something like that? That's probably true, but could it never happen again? Have international norms reached a place where no one will ever do that again? I'm a little skeptical about that, but I very much hope you're right about it. So those are my extremely ad hoc comments about a subject I know next to nothing about, but I had 10 minutes to live, so I used it.
Can I respond, because I find
Yes.
it extremely useful, because I'm hearing you also talk as somebody who knows a lot about certain aspects, that the geopolitical crowd would not know about. So can I just take up your point, sort of?
Sure.
First, you did, and this was wonderful. Thank you very much that you managed to get this.
Now, the first point that you raised, which is how the whole the threat of terrorism also alters the space of the city, and of course surveillance and all kinds of measures are justified because there is a possibility, and New York is a good example of that. You know, New York was an example, as you said, you know, they're over it, but the arms of the state, so to say, are not. So you have all these signs, these warnings, and there's quite a bit of literature done by all kinds of research done by people who show that. So I think that that is an issue, and I didn't mention that. Now, the fact that different cities respond differently, very important. You know, Mumbai responded differently than London, than New York, etc., and I totally agree with that. Now, criminality, handling the question of terrorism as a criminal activity or as a war, I agree, it is not war. And that is why I use the term new wars, because I think that a lot, as I said, war has long traditions. They have tribunals, they have institutions, there are laws of war. I mean, it's very much a process embedded in our Western history, but it is there. So I also frankly think that when the United States went and bombed Iraq, I don't call that war. For me, that's a bombing expedition. It's not war. In the same time that the Mexico-US, so I sort of agree, I don't know if you agree with all of this, but I agree that the distinction between terrorism and war and armed conflict, you know, we're really dealing with three categories. In the same way that I think that the Mexico-US border, you know, the wall, I call that a weaponized border, not a militarized border. The military are a complex institution, you know, and so I think that what we're seeing is a kind of armed conflict that cannot simply be put into the framing of war. I do work on those distinctions. I think they're very important. Now, I must say, I remember when September 11 happened. I was in New York, and we had we were all members of the New York Institute of Humanities, whatever. And so I remember having this extraordinary debate with a couple of people, and Ronald Dworkin was there, and he and I were on one side, and he's a distinguished legal scholar, right? And on the other side were sort of politicians. And we both said, rather than declaring war on Iraq, this should be treated as a criminal act that happened, and use all the low-key tactics to get at the actual, you know, and it would not have become this major thing. So I think that is a very important point. However, that a lot of the stuff that is happening now, it's not that in itself, as I said, you know, it's the thickness of the particular case. That's one thing. But the other thing is that it also becomes part of a much larger condition. You see, so in each site you handle it, the Madrid crowd handled it as a criminal investigation, you know, after the bombings. You have to do that. What has happened is that they then also become part of this global space of war, you know, and then at that point it has exited whatever the conditions of the local within which it takes place, and it becomes a bit of another, you know, another kind of entity. One doesn't exclude the other. I mean, that's a bit the notion. Now for me, again, I just want to emphasize that this notion that we're really dealing with new wars, the gangs. Yes, of course the gangs are, you know, but I'm talking about gangs as a variable. So at one end, you have your average gang, and you know, cities have always had gang warfare. But at this end, I think that some of these gangs, they're not local gangs. We're talking global gangs. You know, they're armed. I mean, the narco gangs in Mexico and in Brazil, we can't use the same language that we have used to talk about, you know, your average sort of gang. Well, there's a lot of killing, but still, these are different. And so in that sense, those are the kinds of gangs. And to treat those simply as criminal and inadequate policing, I think that then we miss something. You know, we sort of collapse it all into one. Yes, you want to deal with them also with the instruments of you know, police, etc. But there is, for me as a social scientist, there is a bigger tale being told. That is what I'm saying. So again, gangs are a variable.
I didn't quite understand that the first time. So I will take the excuse that I was looking through your stuff last night.
Yeah. No, that is
right.
Right.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Now, the question of poverty in cities. look, Dharavi, I know Dharavi has been one of my research sites also, and you know, there's a kind of, it's actually a very, everybody works there, they may all be poor, and it's very complex, etc. You know, there are several slums. I'm beginning to develop this notion of the global city and the global slum. You know, most cities are not that, and most slums are not global. But there's a kind of slum that you can't just call, you know, just define in terms of the miseries of poverty and all of that. So I totally agree with that. But I do think that in many situations, there is a kind of, I think the logic of the system, now this comes to a larger issue, right? The logic of the system is such that people are sort of expelled. And so you have many slums where people are, there's a kind of surplus notion, you know, these are surplus populations. Our slums in New York, in the United States, have very high levels of people who are unemployed, who are poor, who are engaging in sort of low-level gang activity. So that is what I mean. Now, the question of inequality in cities, I think, is forever going to be, you know. I also totally agree that those people know where they are in cities, especially in the, I mean, slums in Asia are a different kind of slum. They are a different kind of slum. Also, they are different from the slums in Africa, you know, and that from Kibera is different from Dharavi, right, the big Nigeria. So, and they're different from the slums in Latin America. So slum is a variable too, right? So on the one hand, what you said, I totally agree with. The question of inequality in cities, poverty in our cities, etc., you know, that's forever going to be a debate. I think we have quite a bit of inequality, and we do warehouse people as surplus populations in jails and in slums. Those are points of disagreement potentially. And now you said one other thing that I wanted to get. As final point, escalating racism. Well, look, in the United States, all that you said, I agree with. And I think there's a lot of data. On the other hand, we also have more virulent anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, I would say, than we had in the past, maybe. You know, it seems to me that we have 300,000 immigrants in jail awaiting trial. I mean, the rates that have started with Bush and have gone on with Obama, and the population are asking for more and more. It seems to me that there is an escalating racism. By racism, I didn't, by the way, just mean black and white. Right, I also mean immigrants. And the other thing I was including that I didn't specify was religion, religious intolerance, and those kinds of issues.
Speaking of religion, I recommend to you the first two verses of Lamentations, where it says, "How lonely sits the city that was full of people, how like a widow she has become. She that was great among nations, princess among provinces, has become tributary. She weeps bitterly in the night, tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her."
Thank you, that's quite... but let me just finish on. And in Europe, racism has escalated, I think, in European cities. But it all coexists, and I think the generational issue is critical also. It all coexists with also a part of the population that is more for intermarriage, that, you know, all of those kinds of things. So one doesn't exclude the other. And I frankly didn't you know, specify with much detail what some of those other issues are that I was focusing on. But some of these urban issues, I was really looking at more the military side. So thank you very much, Richard, for your comments. Thanks.
I had a question. I was trying to think about, you know, what we've been talking about today. A city as an engine of agglomeration, a city, you know, sort of as a place where we have social interaction, and then your work is suggesting that a city has a way of sort of changing conflict, or in fact mitigating against some sorts of conflict. And I wonder, is there anything prescriptive about the work as you're trying to understand this, in the sense that if we can have more of these places of interaction, will there be safer places?
Well, that is a very important question that keeps coming up, because the Congo War has killed 9 million people, you know, is this invisible war. And that, when you go to any international meeting that deals with questions of war and humanitarian issues, that immediately comes up. How come that nobody has noticed it, nobody talks about it, and it's a hit and run war, you know, they come in. So now, if you look at Baghdad, so I just want to put two different cases on that. So that is basically a rural war. You know, most of the sub-Saharan wars are rural, actually. But if you look at Baghdad, the estimate is very enormously, but according to some, 600,000 civilians were killed in the worst years. That is...
In a year?
No, in the worst years. You know, the years like, you know, shortly after the...
But within a 12-month calendar, 600,000
No.
Okay,
The estimate is like for 5 years, you know, from the beginning. In other words, asymmetric war, etc., created, you know. Now that was a tri-symmetric, that is not a good example actually, because that was also a tri, you know,
Right.
There were 2 asymmetries at least at work there. So it seems to me that when you talk to people who are in war zones, they still feel more protected. Whether you speak with them, of course, in Gaza, Gaza is of course all city basically, right? But they feel more protected in cities. Now, I think objectively, the logic of my argument goes, like you say, goes towards saying that a complex environment, and I really mean complex, in other words, you know, not a suburban stretch. I mean a complex system that has enormous diversity of institutions, of built environments, is actually, I repeat it, a weak regime that systemically can diminish the devastating power, destruction of superior power. Yeah. Now, coming back, ever, I never said ever. This reminds me of the other one you said, weak international regime. You said something like, no. But I think at this time, this is not forever. Nothing is forever, right? But at this time, I think that we are dealing in the world with an assemblage. See, it's not a system. It's an assemblage of very diverse elements. They're all weak, but they have a capacity to resist. Very, very powerful actors. So I think to me that is a very interesting condition, and the city is part of that, you see. I mean, when you think of the millions and millions of people that we let die, you know, we're talking about due to diseases, due to all kinds of, and there isn't an uproar, you know, it is, or Haiti itself, look, Haiti, people really were taken in also by the fact, you know, it's an incredible setup that Port-au-Prince is destroyed, the house of the president is destroyed, but that's an earthquake. But there is something about violence done in a complex environment that is embedded. By complex, I mean also something that is not just diverse, but that is embedded with history, right? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about all kinds of things. That, yeah, I mean, that's a bit the thesis. Yes?
But does that really sort of reflect the change in our kind of collective ethos about what's sense of what are immoral kind of
that I'm not so
value.
sure of.
For example, when the Iraq War began, the first thing, whatever little air force the Saddam Hussein had, they moved all their planes near the cities which had very important cultural heritage, because he knew that those cities will not be bombed, and he was protecting his material, the war material, right? So, so we don't bomb cities any longer. I mean, because we're in a higher level of moral power, but it's only at the mercy of the superior power, where the basic assumption that the superior powers have a higher set of morals and ethical standards, by which they wouldn't do corporate bombing.
Yes, of course, but that is one.
So it's not so much the power. If there's a power issue here, it's not that the weaker regime are exercising, using cities as a power tool. They're still very much at the mercy of.
Yes, they are, but that is also the conventional view, you see. That is why it's a weak space, it's a vulnerable space. You can stop the electricity supply, you can stop the water supply, and you wreck the lives of those people. So strictly speaking, it is extremely vulnerable, and it concentrates strategic resources, right? Let me just yes. So what I'm arguing is that there is something else at work here, you know, that is stopping. In terms of the question, you know, is it just the power, you know, it depends on the powerful actor to say, okay, we're not going to bomb this historic site, something like that. Sure, that's also happening. But say Gaza, the bombing of Gaza now by the Israelis could have pulverized Gaza. And the logic that led them to, and they almost did, frankly. You know, when you go to Gaza, it's extreme. It's also interesting, they bombed out quite a few of the you know, like the chicken farm, you know, all these things, you know, but they didn't. And they didn't because, you know, anybody stopped them, really. It's sort of a sticky web of really weak elements, and each situation has a slightly different combination. Now again, this really leaves the zone of the urban. You see, that is why I started at the beginning. I think we're talking about a condition in the geopolitical. And anyhow, so I think that it is not just that. And we did it, you see. And I think what my party was because we wanted to gain the hearts, whatever the reason. See, there's always a logic. And it may look, and the point that I'm getting at is, it may look at that it's always a decision of the one with power. So the United States decides that they also want to win the hearts and minds of whoever. And, well, I think there is something more happening. But again, as I said in my short presentation here, it's like this unnamed X. It's an assemblage of elements that does not have a precise. And so what I'm trying to get at, I'm trying to name that. Now, you know, when you work with people who do the humanitarian regime, etc., they are human rights. You know, these are all my zones of work. They all are dealing with extremely weak instruments, and yet, you know, they're there. Yeah? And so that is my project now. And unlike the international lawyers and the political scientists or IR people who are just looking at instruments of the supranational system, my contribution to this is I bring in the space of the city as some element in the car. And it does open a whole range of windows. Yes. Yes.
Oh, well, I'm just going to ask sort of what the counterfactual is. So if cities are weak regimes and not well equipped to deal with violence, what's the alternative? You know, the countryside is stronger, suburbs are stronger.
No. That is not the logic. I thought the counterfactual would be the war in Congo. 9 million people killed in a decade, and you know, or the counterfactual is the number of people who die of malaria, and we don't react. And compared to the Israelis having pulverized Gaza, for instance, which they couldn't do. I mean, there would have been far fewer people. So it's right, the city is both, as I said, it's both a technology for war, if you're the asymmetric combatant, and it is a technology against war, if you take the city as a space that can modulate, halt, diminish, obstruct the absolute deployment of power of the superior military force. So that is, far more people die without anything going up than for reasons outside cities, you know, for disease, etc. If the Israelis would have, the Israelis killed 1,000 people or whatever in Gaza, it created an international, you know, and it, you know, and it is not just the numbers of people, it's not death per se. I guess that is a basic thing. It's not death per se. We are pretty comfortable with death. But death in a certain setting. So death to me is also a variable. I mean, I'm being super social sciencey in the sense that it's not just the thing in itself, right? It depends how it is embedded, and then it will make a difference. That is a bit the argument. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how quite to marshal my
okay.
my thoughts on this, so I'll just
worry.
kind of let them out in kind of whatever order. But you know, this is thought provoking, and really glad that you came in and shared these with us. One idea is that an analogy comes to mind, and I'm not quite sure why, but of a kind of a mangrove sort of complex, and where a tidal wave is, in a sense, the power of a tidal wave is somehow diffused, and partly because of the rootedness, the intercomplexity, and also the rootedness of this thing. And I think that comes from your sort of, you keep using the word embeddedness, and in a sense that's the sort of rootedness. And part of it may have to do with a kind of symbolic aspect, that in a sense, to the extent that cities are sort of rooted in institutions and in webs of things, and there are representative elements, that there are sort of iconic elements to a certain extent, and that because we, outside of this phenomenon, who are sort of seeing it in ways that do not apply in the Congo, right? We feel ourselves linked to it through that embeddedness, that in a sense, they are embedded in a sense in our experience as sort of quote unquote third-party observers. And so we react to it in a way differently than we would if it's often in the Congo, and we don't somehow feel that connectivity. So I'm not sure how all of those things blur together,
but that's a great image. You know, the mangrove, or the for that matter, the wetlands. That which is a weak regime, so to speak,
and vulnerable in and of itself.
Exactly, could have prevented the extreme flooding that happens in you know, in New Orleans or whatever. And or the Dutch have now returned land to wetlands, because that is the most effective way to contest flooding. So that is a very good example. Now, to the city, we then add all the symbolic stuff, the embedded histories, the embedded also history, if you want, of our great ideas, then that became institutions, right? And there is, in the urban world, and especially more and more today, there is a bit of, you know, mutual recognition, of course. And the parallel track that I mentioned, that the multipolar geopolitical world is also getting sort of enacted through the globalizing of cities, you know. So
the last just little bit I wanted to add to that was, although it seems to me that, especially with the embeddedness part of it, there's more in your story than this, but that nonetheless, would you not agree that your story, or what you're depicting, is much more Foucauldian than, for example, Lilliputian?
I don't know, because see, Foucault, this is a comparison that in other work that I do too, that people say that I'm a Foucauldian. I am not. I mean, a Foucauldian is something, you know, I studied in France, etc. But see, when I talk about the complexity of powerlessness and the capacity of the powerlessness that is complex to make history, to make the political, I am not doing what Foucault does, which is to say that the powerless, the dominated, are complicit in their own domination. That is not what I'm saying. Now, there is a very significant distinction. In a lot of the stuff that I work, one might say that. And in this case, I'm talking about something that is not a complicity in being occupied and being dominated. I'm talking about a complex situation that involves people, that has...
But I don't think of
Foucault, I see, okay, just saying, okay, fine.
I think of it more as the
yes.
multi-capillaries of power, but in a sort of unorganized way, and that's why I make the direct comparison or contrast with a Lilliputian, where in a sense those are ants somehow, that somehow are organized in a way that Foucault's capillaries of power are not. They're more like the mangrove network, which aren't looking to do this, but do it.
You know, I must say, maybe I'm actually more Lilliputian, but I haven't thought about it very seriously. But I wanted to mention something else just as a parallel to, and that is the human rights regime. 20 years ago, a lot of people, weak regime, no enforcement, most of the states that are meant to enforce it are, in fact, abusing their citizens, all of that, right? Now, 20 years ago, many of us were worried, this regime is going nowhere. Today, it's still weak, but now we know it's here to stay, right? Now, what happened? Now, in one way of putting it now, I'm not going to do a whole lecture, I know he's getting worried, so I'm just going to say a very quick thing here. Who gave the regime its muscle? Now, we know the data are there. Immigrants, asylum seekers and women suffering genital mutilation, right? Now, they were the subjects of the law and made the law work. The law became performative because they were good objects to make claims on, etc. So that to me is already an interesting way. Now, none of these people became powerful. Many of these people disappeared in the woodwork and became victims again. We lost track. They didn't become powerful, but they gave the regime its muscle. And I'm interested also in that systemic capacity. So with cities, much more complex systems, I'm looking at the same sort of thing, you know, that there is a world of the city, and then there are some other larger forces that the city sort of, like again, the thing about the current period is really that asymmetric war. Because it's not like France and Germany are going to go to war anytime soon. I don't say ever, okay, again, but within the current.
I was thinking more pressing. Ahmadinejad really does.
Ahmadinejad, yeah. But see, he's not part of, yeah, well, let me just finish this thought here. I lost the track now, because I mean, that also worries me. But anyhow, I mean, most war today is asymmetric war. No, it is asymmetric war. There's just no way around it. So that organizes war, and that also creates this interesting tension that is part of the work for me. Is that in the name of national security, states go to war and they make urban insecurity. So a real interesting tension between the logic of the city and the logic of national state policy. And this is, you know, in certain milieus, these are big subjects for discussion, you know, and how should we rethink a lot of this stuff. And so that is a bit, and you bring in the city, it's a very interesting, and not just the human rights and the civil society activists, you know, and whatever, the global media commenting and critiquing. The city is this objective thingy there that also demonstrates or evinces a certain kind of capability.
I don't want to have the last one.
Well, then we'll do two.
You're senior, so I could go and then you can.
Okay. I was just going to ask about invasion.
Invasion?
Invasion. You know, I don't really use that word today, but
yeah.
Oftentimes people think about invasion as being part of war. And I was thinking about your, you talked about immigration and...
You want to make that a friendly amendment to Richard's list of 4?
Well, sacking kind of goes with invasion.
Well, no, but there's quiet takeover. And so some people accuse Mexican immigration as being an invasion. And then they want to respond to it as if it were like a warlike act.
Yes.
When in fact it's just people.
Right.
But it's, you know, it's an issue of territory and belonging and possession.
No, absolutely. I mean, in my last book, the
most recent.
Actually, not even the most recent, but the one that I really worked on. The title begins with territory, you know, and my publisher almost killed me. How could you territory in today's year? I said, yeah, we need to recover the category territory because it functions in multiple ways. So when you say there was an invasion, you know, yes, but I do think that the tension in my work, the productive tension, is to take the notion of war, the category war, all right, very seriously, to make the difference with all of these other things. So the invasion, this experience of being, because it's an experience also, it's not just, you know, of being invaded. It's different from war. In the same way I think that the 6-week bombing expedition of Iraq, to me that was not war.
Yeah, you made it clear you have a very strong definition of war.
Well, I'm taking actually the classic definition. You know, there is an enormous amount of law that defines what is war and what is not war. That was a big issue in Guantanamo, remember? The insistence, these are not war prisoners. Remember, because that would have created a whole other setting. I mean, war is a highly regulated activity, believe it or not. I mean, you know, I have a hard time believing it, but when you go into the literature on law, and the law, especially when you talk with international lawyers, you know, there's a law. They have their own tribunals, they have their own. So I am looking, and that is why this is a different mix of elements. And the city then becomes a very interesting actor, you see. But anyhow, yes, you have the last question, I think.
Going back to cities and how they deal with war and terrorism.
Right.
something you said that I thought was very true was that places like New York actually recovered better from the terrorism than the places outside of it. And the thing that I thought was because they have to. They don't really have an option other than getting on with it, as the Brits would say. And it reminded me a lot of something that Harvey Mollich has studied when he studied subways and safety. And he's got this MSF grant, and he studied how safe are the subways, and they get all this money to make them safer. And what he found out was, we can't really do anything if there's a terrorist attack. I mean, the subway is pretty screwed.
Oh yeah.
But what they have done is made subways so good that it's the pedestrian way that a subway is regulated that essentially helps us in a time of crises. And in some ways it speaks to your notion of civic society, that people are generally, oddly, that people are actually behaving themselves for the most part, besides these crazy outlying experiences.
Well, that is the other important point, is to what extent we manage to live in extremely crowded, environments marked by the possibility, at least, of enormous intolerance. So now in the suburbs, see, I've never lived in a suburb. I confess, I feel like an absolutely. But it seems to me that, at least now coming back to England, because I spent so much time in London, you hear these amazing stories, and it only happens out there in the small, where they have their plot of land, or the garden, right? And the tree that overcrowded the crop. And these are wars between neighbors around in a very, very little space, because, and of course neighbors are often, so, I'm just mentioning that as a total footnote, but it seems to me that the city works partly because systemically it induces a kind of tolerance, of difference, of different demeanor, of different, as opposed to the village, where, So there is something about that. This is not my forte, I must tell you, that kind of the more social side of the city, but I would agree with you. Well, thank you very much. I realize this was so way off the map for people.